We're going to start today with story time with a selection from one of my favorite history books called A Little History of the World by E.H. Gombrich, who was a historian who wrote this book kind of as a way to tell world history in the form of a bedtime story to children, and I love it. This is going to set the stage for the transitions that get us to the Enlightenment. Starting with popular beliefs and superstitions of the early modern period, or their worldview. So this is all from that wonderful book. I'm just going to read it to y'all. The Protestant Reformation unleashed a new kind of religious division in Europe. Before, Europeans had all been Christians, united under the Catholic Church. Now, still Christian, they were divided, Catholic or Protestant. Kings chose sides, and their countries became Catholic or Protestant. The majority persecuted the minority as heretics. Catholic countries fought Protestant countries. If I wished, I could write many more chapters on the wars between Catholics and Protestants, but I won't. It was a dreadful era. Events soon became so confused that people no longer knew why or against whom they were fighting. On top of all this misery and despair, a terrible madness began to infect a growing number of people. The fear of evil spells, of sorcery, and witchcraft. People had also been superstitious in the Middle Ages and had believed all sorts of ghouls and ghosts, as you remember. But it was never as bad as this. Things had begun to get worse during the time of the power and splendor-loving popes, the time we know as the Renaissance, when the new St. Peter's Church was being built and indulgences were sold. Those popes weren't pious, but that only made them all the more superstitious. They were afraid of the devil and every conceivable form of magic. And each of the popes of the period around 1500, whose names we associate with the most wonderful works of art, was also responsible for chilling decrees calling for witches and sorcerers to be hunted down without mercy, especially in Germany. You may ask, how is it possible to hunt down something that isn't there and never was? And that is precisely why it was so terrible. If a woman wasn't liked in her village, perhaps because she was a little odd or made people feel uncomfortable, anyone could suddenly say, that woman's a witch. She's the cause of those hailstorms we've been having. Or, she gave the mayor his bad back. And in fact, both in Italian and in German, people still use the expression witch hurt when talking about a backache. Then the woman would be arrested and interrogated. They would ask her if she was in league with the devil. Naturally, she would be horrified and deny it. But then they would torture her and torment her for so long and in such a dreadful way that, half dead with pain, she would admit to anything in her despair. And that was it. Now that she had confessed to being a witch, she would be burned alive. Often, while she was being tortured, they would ask if there were other witches in the village making magic with her. And in her weakness, she might blurt out any name that came into her head in the hope that the torture would stop. Then others in turn would be arrested and tortured until they confessed and were burned. Fear of the devil and witchcraft were rife during the dreadful period after the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics. In Catholic and Protestant districts alike, thousands and thousands of people were burned. The few Jesuit, a type of Catholic, priests who protested against this madness were powerless to stop it. People in those days lived in a state of constant fear of the unknown, of magical powers and the works of the devil. Only this fear can begin to explain the atrocities inflicted on so many thousands of innocent people. What is most remarkable, however, is that at a time when people were at their most superstitious, there were still some who had not forgotten the ideas of Leonardo da Vinci and the other great Florentines, people who went on using their eyes in order to see and make sense of the world. And it was they who discovered the real magic, magic that lets us look into the past and into the future, and enables us to work out what a star billions of miles away is made of, and to predict precisely when an eclipse of the sun is due and from what part of the earth it will be visible. This magic was arithmetic, or math. Of course, these people didn't invent it, for merchants had always been able to add and subtract, but they came increasingly aware of the number of things in nature that are governed by mathematical laws. How a clock with a pendulum 981 millimeters long needs exactly 1 second per swing, and why this is so. They called these the laws of nature. Leonardo da Vinci had already said that nature doesn't break her own laws, and so it was known with certainty that if you take any natural event and measure and record it precisely, you will discover that, given the same circumstances, the result will always be the same, no matter how often it is repeated. Indeed, it cannot be different. This was an extraordinary discovery, and a far greater magic than anything the poor witches were accused of. For now the whole of nature, the stars and drops of water, falling stones and vibrating violin strings, was no longer just one incomprehensible tangle that made people fearful and uneasy. If you knew the correct mathematical formula, you had a magic spell for anything. You could say to a violin string, to make an A, you must be this long and this tight and move backwards and forwards 435 times in a second. And the note the string made would prove it. The first man to understand the extraordinary magical power of applying mathematical calculation to things in nature was an Italian named Galileo Galilei. He had devoted many years to observing, analyzing, and describing such things when, one day, someone denounced him for writing exactly what Leonardo had observed, but not explained. What he had written was this: the sun does not move. On the contrary, it is the earth which moves around the sun, together with the planets. This discovery had already been made by a Polish scholar named Copernicus after many years of calculation. It had been published in 1543, not long after Leonardo's death, and shortly before his own. But the theory had been denounced as unchristian and heretical by Catholic and Protestant priests alike. They pointed to a passage in which Joshua, the great warrior, asks God not to let dusk fall until his enemy is destroyed. In answer to his prayer, we read, "The sun stood still, and the moon stayed, until the people had avenged themselves on their enemies." If the Bible says the sun stood still, people argued, then the sun must normally be in motion, and to suggest that the sun did not move was therefore heretical and contradicted what was written in the Bible. So, in 1632, when he was nearly 70 years old, Galileo, who had devoted his whole life to scholarship, was brought before the religious tribunal known as the Inquisition, and made to choose between being burned as a heretic or renouncing his theory about the movement of the earth around the sun. He signed a declaration saying that he was but a poor sinner, for he had taught the earth moved around the sun. In this way he avoided being burned, the fate of so many of his predecessors. Nevertheless, when he had signed the declaration, he is to have muttered under his breath, "And yet, it moves." None of these fixed ideas was in the end able to prevent Galileo's ideas and methods and all the discoveries he made from influencing and inspiring people in ever-increasing numbers. And if today, thanks to mathematical formulas, we can make nature do whatever we want, so that we have telephones, airplanes, and computers, and all the rest of our modern technology, we should be grateful to all those who, like Galileo, investigated nature's mathematical laws at a time when it was almost as dangerous a thing to do as it was to be a Christian in Nero's day, in ancient Rome, when they were persecuting Christians. Chapter 33, A Truly New Age, the Enlightenment. If you could talk to a gentleman from the 1700s, there would be many things about him that would surprise you, the way he spoke and the many Latin and French words he used. His elaborate and convoluted turns of phrase and habit of slipping in Latin quotations that neither you nor I could place, and his grand and solemn bows. You would, I think, suspect that beneath that venerable wig was someone with a large appetite for good food and fine wines. And, if you will forgive me for mentioning it, you could hardly fail to notice that beneath the fancy lace, the embroidery, and the silk, this prinked, perfumed, and powdered gentleman stank, because he hardly ever washed. But nothing could prepare you for the shock you would have if he were to begin to air his views. All children should be thrashed or beaten. Young girls, no more than children, should be married, and to men they barely know. A peasant's lot is to toil and not complain. Beggars and tramps should be whipped and put in chains in the marketplace for everyone to mock. Thieves should be hanged and murderers publicly chopped into pieces. Witches and other harmful sorcerers that infest the country should be burnt. People of different beliefs should be persecuted, treated as outcasts, or thrown into dark dungeons. A comet seen recently in the sky must mean bad times ahead. As protection against the coming plague, which has already claimed so many victims in Venice, it would be sensible to wear a red armband. And finally, a Mr. So-and-so, an English friend, has an excellent and well-established business selling Negroes from Africa to America as slaves. A brainwave of that most worthy gentleman since, as we all know, American Indian convicts don't take well to manual labor. And you would hear these opinions not only from the mouth of some coarse or uncouth fellow, but from the most intelligent and pious people in all walks of life and from all nations. Only after 1700 did things gradually change. The widespread and terrible suffering that Europeans endured during the wretched wars of religion had some people wonder if it was really right to judge someone by his or her religious belief. Was it not more important to be a good and honest human being? Would it not be better if people got on with one another, regardless of any differences of opinion or belief that they might have? Better if they respected one another and tolerated each other's convictions. This was the first and most important idea that the people who thought about such things now voiced, the principle of tolerance. Only in matters of religion could there be differences of opinion. No rational person disputes the fact that 2 + 2 makes 4. Therefore, reason, or sound common sense, as they also termed it, is what can and should unite all men. In the realm of reason, you can use arguments to convince others of the rightness of your opinions, whereas another's religious belief, being beyond rational argument, should be respected and tolerated. And so reason was the second most important thing to these people. Clear and reasoned thinking about mankind and nature was rediscovered in the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans, and in those of the Florentines during the time of the Renaissance. But, more than anywhere else, it was to be found in the works of men like Galileo, who had boldly set out to investigate the magic of nature's mathematical formulas. Differences of belief played no part in these things. There was only experiment and proof. Reason alone could explain the appearance of nature and the workings of the universe. Reason, which is given in equal measure to all mankind the world over. Now, if reason is given to all, it must follow that all people are of equal worth. And as you remember, that was just what Christianity had taught, that all men are equal before God. But those who preached tolerance and reason took this argument one step further. They didn't only teach that all people were essentially equal, they demanded that they be treated equally as well, that every human being, as God's creature, endowed by him with reason, had rights, that no one might or should deny him. The right to choose his own calling, and to choose how he lived, and the freedom to act or not to act as his reason and his conscience dictated. Children, too, should not be taught with the cane, so with something to beat them with, but with reason, so that they might come to understand the difference between right and wrong. And criminals were human beings, too. No doubt they had done wrong, but they could still be helped to mend their ways. It was dreadful, they argued, to brand a man's cheek or forehead with a red-hot iron for one wrongdoing, leaving a mark that he would bear for the rest of his life, so that all might say, that man is a criminal. There was something, they said, which forbade a person to be publicly humiliated. It was called human dignity. All these ideas, which from 1700 onwards were debated first in England and later in France, came to be called the Enlightenment, because the people who held them wanted to combat the darkness of superstition with the pure light of reason. Many people today think that the Enlightenment only taught what was obvious, and that people in those days had a rather simple view of the great mysteries of nature and the world. This is true, but you must realize that what seems obvious to us wasn't in the least so then, and that it took a great deal of courage, self-sacrifice, and perseverance for people to keep on repeating them so that they seem obvious to us today. And of course, you must also realize that reason cannot and never will give us the key to all mysteries, although it has often put us on the right track. In the 200 years that followed the Enlightenment, more mysteries of nature were studied and explained than in the preceding 2,000 years. But what you must never forget is the importance for our own lives of tolerance, reason, and humanity, the three fundamental principles of the Enlightenment. Because of them, we no longer take someone suspected of having committed a crime and torture them inhumanely on the rack until, half out of their wits, they confess to anything we want. Reason has taught us that there's no such thing as witchcraft, so no more witches are burnt at the stake. The last time a woman was convicted of witchcraft, it was in England in 1712. Diseases are no longer fought by superstitious means, but mainly through cleanliness and the scientific investigation of their causes. We don't have slaves or peasant serfs anymore. All citizens are subject to the same laws, and women have the same rights as men. All of this we owe to the brave citizens and writers who dared stand up for these ideas, and it was daring. They may have lacked understanding, and they may have behaved unjustly in their struggle with ancient and long-held traditions, but they fought a long and hard battle to win tolerance, reason, and humanity. The battle would have taken much longer and involved far greater sacrifices if some of Europe's rulers hadn't fought in the front lines for these ideas of the Enlightenment. One of the first to do so was Frederick the Great, King of Prussia, who, as an aside, sadly, we don't have time to learn about in this unit. At the same time as Austria and Germany were witnessing the triumph of the ideas of the Enlightenment, in America, the inhabitants of many British colonies were refusing to be British subjects any longer or to pay British taxes. In their fight for independence, they were led by Benjamin Franklin, an ordinary citizen who spent much of his time studying the natural sciences, in the course of which he invented the lightning conductor. He was a plain and upright man, energetic and hardworking. Under his leadership and that of another American, George Washington, the British colonies and trading ports organized themselves into a confederation and, after a long struggle, drove the British soldiers from their shores. Now they too could adopt the principles of the new way of thinking. In 1776, they declared the sacred rights of all men to liberty and equality to be the founding principles of their new state. But for the Negro slaves on their plantations, life simply went on as before. We're going to be studying this epic movement, the Enlightenment, in several parts. The first part we're going to focus on is the main focus on government. What do governments owe people? What rights do people have that don't come from the government, that come just from the fact that they're human beings, that government should protect? And to understand this, you have to remember that we're talking about a society that lived under absolute monarchy. So government with no limits, who felt that it was accountable to nobody, during a time when people the king perceived to be enemies could just be picked up off the street and tortured. The idea of human rights did not exist before the Enlightenment, and this is the way that they were invented. This is also the basis for legitimacy for modern thinking on government. Our government follows a social contract, or it ought to. And so in learning about social contract theory, the source of modern legitimacy for democratic, enlightened states, you're also learning about your rights, what you can expect from your government, what your government owes to you, and what should happen if the government doesn't hold up its end of the bargain. To get ourselves settled in terms of time and place, the Enlightenment started around 1700, but again, like lines blur between scientific revolution and Enlightenment and Renaissance. And generally, Europe looked like it is on the map during this time period. Here's a really great timeline for kind of situating ourselves, because it shows you these overlapping characters of politics in blue, art and the Renaissance generally in yellow, the scientific revolution in green, the Protestant Reformation in pink, and then all of the political thinkers that together collectively form what we call the Enlightenment in red at the very bottom. And you'll see that a lot of these changes in thought, these new thinkers existed kind of in overlapping categories. The main theme for all of the changes kind of represented in this timeline is the increasing application of reason and rationalism into human affairs, be they art, science, and now when we get to the Enlightenment, public affairs, meaning politics, government, and society. So I've been using the word rationalism a lot, and here I'd like to remind us about a lesson from Ancient Athens. There are a couple different ways of thinking about the world, like making sense of it. And then there are behaviors that kind of pair with those ways of thinking. If you look at the top right quadrant, you will see the way that most empires, most big, strong, authoritarian governments encourage their populations to think, and the way that absolute monarchs and Catholic Church officials wanted the populations to think, based on faith, which means accepting authority, supporting existing institutions, claiming certainty from religious texts, and being very resistant to changing ideas when new evidence arises. For a population that thinks based on faith, the behavior that pairs with it is obedience. People should follow orders from authority figures. This usually involves self-sacrifice for the benefit of society and loyalty to people in power or powerful ideas that govern society. On the bottom left, you'll see the quadrant that was pioneered in ancient Athens and revived during the Renaissance, and then even more strongly during the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. As opposed to faith, as opposed to understanding the world based on just believing what you're told, we have logic. Logic is fantastic because it's a system of rules that will reliably shape your thinking to lead it to correct and true conclusions. If you think logically, you're skeptical of accepted beliefs. You want to think for yourself and see if they pan out. Logical thinkers argue that humans can use their reason to understand the world. You can think through problems and make sense of the world that way. And it involves the belief that blind faith is ignorant and demands evidence to support ideas. In the modern world, we are by far, in everybody's daily life anyway, and certainly at school, far more logical thinkers than thinkers who behave based on faith. Paired with logic comes a behavior, and that behavior is near and dear to every teenager I've ever met, and for good reason. It's a great habit. Questioning authority. Instead of just obeying blindly, if you question authority, you're skeptical. You demand justification or rationale for orders. You want proof. You want evidence. And you typically want checks on government power. People who question authority tend to be mistrustful of big, absolutist, powerful structures. If you were a rationalist, what problem do you think you would have with being ruled over by a guy that swears that he has the right to rule over you because God says so? If you were a rationalist, as increasingly thinkers became during the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment, it would seem absurd that divine right theory was the basis for government. It would seem crazy, much as it seems to my students when I first introduced the topic. Like, did people really believe that? Yes, people believed based on faith. They tended to obey. We, in the modern world, are more logical. We question authority. And as rationalists, we see divine right theory, and it's almost funny. Like, okay, God says that I'm in charge now. Now give me all your tax money, right? This is the shift that the Enlightenment promoted, from faith and obedience down to questioning and logic. And we're going to see that on several levels. But first and foremost, starting with like the basis for power. Who gives the king the right to rule over us? What is government for? The Enlightenment was responding to several social and political problems in early modern Europe. Namely, divine right is a terrible basis for government for a rationalist society. Rationalists think critically, demand evidence and proof. They value logic, they value skepticism and questioning. For a rationalist, divine right theory is completely irrational. It makes no sense. It cannot be proven. And furthermore, it serves no useful purpose to the public. Early modern Europe was also a very burn the witch, burn the heretic level of superstitious and intolerant, and that was problematic in society. Third, absolute monarchs with absolute power over their states could have people jailed or worse if they didn't like what they were saying or for any reason at all. All of this is not rational. It's terrible if you want to like really put a word to it. And that's my word. I would not want to live in a society like this. Enlightenment philosophers, though, inspired by the scientific revolution's confidence in reason and proof and a scientific method to fix problems, decided to try to use reason to fix these problems. And in doing so, they invented something really important called human rights. Human rights, as an idea, had to be invented. The idea that the government has responsibilities to its people had to be invented, and this is when that happened. Enlightenment philosophers used a process similar to the scientific method and their power to reason to invent them. Specifically, to think through the purpose of government and the relationship between individuals in society and the power that rules them. Who gets to tell people what to do? What do they owe the people? These Enlightenment philosophers made observations and experimented with a thought experiment that if you're in my class, you're about to do. And the conclusion, the big takeaway, is that their thinking replaced divine right theory with something called social contract theory, which was a much more rational basis for government, so rational, in fact, that our modern view of government starts from the same theory. To understand this lesson, there are going to be several words, vocabulary words that may be unfamiliar to you. If you want to pause the slide here and write these 4 down, it wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. Enlightenment philosophers thought about human nature as a basis for their thinking. By human nature, I mean distinguishing characteristics like ways of thinking, ways of feeling, ways of acting that humans have naturally without anything external shaping their behavior, like without laws or government telling them how to behave. How do people behave? They also thought about something called natural law, which refers to guidelines or rules that we as human beings follow naturally or innately without needing to be told to. They thought about natural rights, meaning rights that we're entitled to simply because we're human beings, not rights granted by law or given to us by a government, but rights that exist without the existence of law at all, universal rights. Finally, in order to think through how to form a rational society, they used a concept called the state of nature. The state of nature is an imaginary situation, it's a hypothetical, in which people exist without government or law to shape their behavior. And it's used in social contract theory to think through how to justify political authority. It's the hypothetical or again imaginary condition before humanity formed a civil state or a rule of law, before people formed a government or a formal social structure. So these ideas all guide Enlightenment thinking that leads us to the social contract. Do you think human nature is selfish or rational or compassionate? What rules do you think people follow naturally? Do you think people just look out for their own survival and that's it? Do you think people treat each other the way they'd want to be treated? What rights do you think that people have without having governments need to grant them? The right to life, maybe, but is there anything else? And then without government, without any external law or power or rules to shape the way that people behave, how would you imagine life to be? What would the state of nature be like? Would it be, a free-for-all, just war? Would it be, little tiny tribes of people kind of peacefully coexisting most of the time? What would life without government be like? And a way for high schoolers to think through this that works really well is like, what would school be like if we removed all authority figures? How would students treat each other? And now we come to our key points for the day. Just basic information about the Enlightenment and social contract theory that we'll be building on. First, a definition. The Enlightenment was an 18th century intellectual movement to rationalize society and government that proposed social contract theory as the new basis for legitimacy, replacing divine right, and articulating fundamental natural human rights that governments must respect. This was a challenge to how valid ideas based on faith and tradition were, and clearly it was a challenge to the divine right of kings and therefore absolute monarchy. Enlightenment philosophers proposed to replace divine right theory, which was the irrational view that power comes from God and the king owes his people nothing, with a social contract as the basis of legitimacy, legitimacy meaning the right to rule. So what is a social contract? This is like the vocabulary word that you need to put a big star next to because it's important. It takes a little practice to get used to the concept, but it's important that you get used to it so that you can defend your rights in the modern world too. The social contract is an implicit, so understood, unwritten, agreement between the people in a society to cooperate for social benefits, sacrificing some individual freedom for state protection, and establishing the ideal purpose and powers of government. So it's an agreement, nobody writes it down, nobody signs it, but in living in a society, we have agreed to the social contract. We're going to cooperate for the benefits of living together in a society, and in doing that, we give up some individual freedoms. In exchange, we want the protection of the law. In this agreement, the state is supposed to protect people's natural rights, however you define them. And in exchange, the people give up some of their individual rights, like the right to run around naked in the streets. It causes chaos, we don't do it. It's a right that we've given up whether we know it or not, for the benefits of society. We give it these small individual rights to make it possible to live together in harmony. Individuals give up their absolute freedom from the state of nature when they come together as a society and establish a government. They agree to follow the law, and the government must in exchange protect their natural rights by implementing a justice system, for example. If I have the natural right to life, I want a justice system that protects that, maybe by making murder illegal, maybe by prosecuting people who murder other people. A government that fails to protect people's natural rights under social contract theory is not legitimate. This gets us to the purpose of government. Why do we even have governments to begin with? Humans form governments in order to fix the flaws of the state of nature, entering into a social contract. We give up some individual freedoms in order to get security or protection. The social contract ideally should fix whatever problem exists in this hypothetical world without government. And the ideal government is one that can help enforce and maintain the social contract. This varies depending on how natural rights are defined, as we will see. It's okay if this is a little confusing. This will become very clear over the next several lessons. And really, the Enlightenment was all about trying to figure out what rights people should keep, what the purpose of government is, and what the social contract should consist of. Ultimately, even though different Enlightenment philosophers came to different conclusions about the ideal government, the underlying thought process they went to, which is a variation on the scientific method, was the same, and you guys are about to do the same thing. So, pause the slide here for a moment and get what you've understood of the Enlightenment and the social contract into your notes, remembering to summarize. And pause the video here to add questions or thoughts or observations to our class chat.